Okay, right, great. Hello, welcome to this public lecture, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome as our speaker Åsa Wigforss from Stockholm University, and Åsa's going to give us a talk entitled "Fact Resistance: What is it, and how can it be cured?" And I believe this is in many ways related to a book you published recently, which you're going to wave.
Yes, in Swedish, I'm afraid, but there you go. Yes.
Okay, great.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here and talk about this important topic. So, so here are a bunch of terms that only like 2 years ago we thought we'd never hear, I think. Fact resistance. What a strange concept. Why would anyone ever resist the facts? You need to know the facts to get around in the world, right? Alternative facts. Even stranger, what might that be? Post-truth? Seriously? Fake news? News are things that have happened. Fake news? What is that? Very strange. Only 2 years ago, we would have been shocked to see these concepts being used daily, the way they are now. So the question is, what is going on? And that's what I tried to figure out in my book, because I was stunned and shocked by all this, and decided to try to look to the philosophy and the psychology behind the phenomena that's going on. It also has to do with our current media situation, so I will talk a bit about that. But we have to start from the beginning, and that is always philosophy. So, people talk about fact resistance, and I prefer to talk about knowledge resistance. And the reason for this is pretty simple. It's just this. So facts, philosophers think of facts as things that are out there, things in the world. It's a fact that the sun was shining today. It's a fact that we're here at the Sterling Court Hotel. It's a fact that Trump is president, not that Hillary Clinton is president. So there are lots of facts, and you immediately realize there are tons of facts that we human beings don't know and will never know. Facts that are too far away in time and space for us to ever know, and facts that we are probably too cognitively limited to ever be able to understand and therefore to know. So perhaps things like the nature of consciousness belongs to this, maybe the origin of the universe is something we can never properly take in, even if there's a fact of matter. So that's fine. So we are fact resistant in a certain sense. There are lots of facts we don't take in and we won't ever take in. But that's not what's going on now, right? What's going on now is something else. It's not like there's lots of facts we can't get knowledge of. What's going on now largely is that there's knowledge that we don't, for whatever reason, want to take in certain situations. Certain situations we resist knowledge. That's why I prefer talking about knowledge resistance instead of fact resistance. So, if that's what it is, then we have to try to understand what knowledge is. And this is something that philosophers have been talking about since Plato. So, if you Google knowledge, and you look for pictures of knowledge, which is a strange thing to do, you get this. This is what you get. Brains and flashy things and synapses and things like that. Now, it's quite intuitive to think of knowledge as something like that, something in the head. But philosophers since Plato have made quite clear that can't be right. And the reason it can't be right is simple. So, obviously, there is some part of knowledge that's in our heads. I can't know that I'm in Stirling if I don't believe it. If I believe I'm in Edinburgh, then I can't know that I'm in Stirling. I have to have a belief about how things are. And this belief, arguably, is in the head. Now, philosophers will maybe dispute that, but let's just take that for granted now. But, as Plato already pointed out, that's not enough for you to have knowledge, no matter how convinced you are, no matter how certain you are about your belief, unless the belief is true, it's not knowledge. So I can't know that I'm in Edinburgh right now because I'm not. I'm in Stirling. Right. So knowledge is not in the head because knowledge requires truth, and that's something that's independent of our psychological state for the most part. Now, Plato already made clear that this is not sufficient either. Why is that? So I have a true belief. Why is that not sufficient for knowledge? Well, the idea is pretty simple. It's just this, that sometimes we get lucky. We guess. Now, we don't usually guess where we are, because we know that, but let me guess something else. How many of you had coffee for breakfast rather than tea? Well, I'm in the UK, maybe I have to. In Sweden it's 92%, I think. Here I would go for 74%. Is that? Now, let's assume I guess that 74% of you had coffee this morning rather than tea. Let's assume I'm right. Maybe I'm right. Do I have knowledge? Philosophers since Plato say, no, you don't have knowledge because there's something missing. It was just a guess. And what is this thing that's missing? Well, some kind of relation between me, my belief, and this fact that 74% of you had coffee, namely some evidence. I haven't done anything to figure this out. I haven't asked you, I haven't done any investigations, so I don't know it. So philosophers think that for you to have knowledge, it's not enough to have a certain certainty in your belief, you also have to have a true belief that is in some sense justified. These are the three conditions that have been with us since Plato. Now, philosophers discuss whether there might be some further condition you need, but for the purposes here, all we need to know is that you need to have these things in place. You need to have a belief, you need to be true, and you need to have some kind of evidence. So, normally things go the way they should. They go this way. Normally things go well. There are the facts, there's some evidence coming in, and we form our beliefs on the basis of that, and we get knowledge. Now, this is how it goes, not just normally, but absolutely most of the time, right? If we didn't do that, we couldn't make it through the day. A knowledge-resistant creature would be an evolutionary impossibility. You couldn't live long enough to procreate if you were knowledge-resistant because the tiger would eat you. Or today, the truck would hit you, right? So you need knowledge the knowledge mechanisms to work well most of the time. But sometimes they don't. And what is it that happens then? Well, you can pretty much characterize all the situations in this way. Something comes in the way, namely emotions. Now, there are all sorts of different psychological mechanisms here, and I will talk about those soon, but they are characterized by strong emotions being involved one way or the other. Emotions kick in and make you resist the evidence, which makes it the case that you will not get to have a belief about the facts. So here we have a famous example, of course. To the right, we all know what this is. To the right, you have the January 20th, 2017 in the Washington Mall. Trump is being inaugurated. He stands way up here, right? And he looks out and he sees people as far as his eyes can reach. So he thinks to himself, being Trump, he thinks, this is the biggest audience ever at a presidential inauguration. During the day, some mean journalist puts up these two pictures together. This, of course, is the January 20th, 2009, the day that Barack Obama is standing up there to being inaugurated. So people think, well, it kind of looks like there's more people here than there. It's a little hard to determine exactly how many people, because there are not tickets sold for this event, right? So it's just a matter you have to estimate. So the crowd experts, they go in and look at the density and the spread of the audience and so on. But they estimated that it's probably about 30% more here. Now, Trump, of course, still believes it's the biggest audience ever. And he gets very, very angry when people question this. Not only this, Trump voters believe it's the biggest audience ever. Experiments with Trump voters looking at this have them saying that it looks like there are more people there. Now, it's a little hard to know exactly what people believe there, but still. And we all know what happened, right? So he keeps insisting it's the biggest audience. Then his then press secretary Sean Spicer comes out and says, look, this was the biggest audience at a presidential installation ever, period. And people say, well, seriously? What about the evidence? There was also evidence from the bus tickets sold and all that. then, of course, the next thing that happens is that Kellyanne Conway runs out on TV and says, well, Sean Spicer is just presenting alternative facts. And that's how we got that concept. That's where it's from. Okay, this I think is a very good example of how emotions come in the way. People believe, in this case, Trump and his fellows, God knows what Sean Spicer really believed, but people believe what they want to believe, not what they have reason to believe. Now, we all do this. This is not something distinctive of Trump. This is something we all do in certain situations. Now, there are other obstacles to knowledge. In my book, I talk about the enemies of knowledge. There are inner enemies or obstacles and outer obstacles. And here, of course, is the important outer obstacle that we encounter today, namely the massive spread of disinformation that make you form your beliefs not on the basis of real evidence, but on disinformation. And you're not going to get knowledge. So I will talk about these. Now I'm going to talk about these obstacles, the inner obstacles first, and then the outer obstacles, and then what we can do about the whole thing. That's the plan. But first, we need to say a couple of more words about knowledge. Because in order to understand these inner obstacles, we need to think a little bit more about the nature of knowledge. And so still a little bit of philosophy and then some psychology. So if you think about the central notion then is evidence. You could really call it evidence resistance, what's going on, right? So you need to think a little bit about what evidence might be for human beings. So there are two obvious kinds of evidence that we use all the time. There is the sensory evidence from what we see and hear and feel, things like that. But what's distinctive of human knowledge is precisely that sensory evidence forms a very small part of our evidence. Most of our knowledge we don't get from our senses, from our experiences, but we get from other people. And this philosophers call testimonial knowledge. So if you think about what you know about the world, you will soon realize very little of that you know because you've been there and seen that and felt that. The sensory evidence is important in daily life, but it really doesn't go very far when it comes to human knowledge. And this makes us distinctive. Now these, if you compare us to our closest relatives, these are chimpanzees, the bonobo chimpanzees, you probably know about those. They're quite interesting because they're very smart. They're cognitively quite advanced. They're also very social, which is a quality they have in common with us. The smartest of them, one of the more famous ones, named Kanzi, you can train to use symbols in a quite sophisticated way to put together, to communicate in quite a sophisticated way and put together new claims, as it were, with these symbols. They can't talk because they don't have the physiology for that, but they can communicate with the help of these symbols. So they can reach the level of linguistic capacity almost of a 3-year-old, but it stops there. It stops there. So they don't ever develop a language of the sort that we do. And that means, that has implications for their knowledge, because it means that each generation of these chimpanzees, they start from scratch as far as knowledge goes. It's not the case that next generation chimpanzees will know more than the earlier generation. Each one starts from scratch. So this is a huge difference between us and these chimpanzees, because, of course, each generation humans know vastly more than the earlier one. Right. So this, of course, is an amazing strength about human knowledge. We have a division of labor in our culture, in our society. We all become specialists in whatever we do. If you're a baker or a gardener or a philosopher or a doctor, you become a specialist. You accumulate knowledge that you can spread to others through language, and then it can be accumulated and saved in books and so on, and saved on to the next generation. This makes human knowledge unique, incredibly strong, but it also makes us very, very vulnerable. Precisely because we get so much of our knowledge from other people, when things go wrong, when people can't be trusted, when people don't know what they're talking about, we are going to be misled, and we will end up having a lot of false beliefs. And this is on no fault of our own. So a human being can have a whole worldview that's fundamentally mistaken. That could never happen to a chimpanzee, right? A whole worldview that's fundamentally mistaken. And without being, as it were, culpable, because it's just bad luck. You've grown up in the wrong situation, you can end up with huge amounts of false beliefs. All right, so let me say two words about truth before we get to psychological mechanisms that underlie the problem we're talking about. So, philosophers have also talked about truth since antiquity. One famous philosopher, another famous one, Aristotle said that, well, the truth is, to say what is that it is the truth. To say of what is not, that it's not, is false. Then there are lots of theories about truth, of course, since then. But I think one thing to notice here is for most statements, truth is perfectly objective in at least this sense, and all serious theories of truth accept this. It's independent of our beliefs. So what I believe about the weather and what you believe about the weather and what the whole world believes about the weather does not determine whether, in fact, it is raining. Now, this notion of objective truth is, sometimes people say, oh, that's so dogmatic. You shouldn't speak of objective truth that way. People have all sorts of different views and so on. And in a way, that's getting things backwards, precisely because truth is objective, independent of our beliefs, we have every reason not to be dogmatic. We should be humbled by the fact that we may be wrong. And this, I think, is the cornerstone of being an anti-dogmatic worldview, is to be accepting of the fact that we may be wrong. So if you're subjectivist, if you think truth is just a matter of what you believe, then you have every reason to be dogmatic. So objectivism about truth goes with anti-dogmatism. Okay. Now, philosophers are quite aware, of course, that not everything we say is, as it were, a candidate for objective truth. Here is one that we have debated much in my home. Broccoli is tasty. True or false? Well, I tell my children early on, let's not discuss this one anymore. Philosophers are quite clear that this is not a very good candidate for a factual statement, for something that there is a fact of the matter, whether broccoli is tasty or not. It's rather something, if there is some truth here, there's going to be some very relativistic thing. It's true for me that broccoli is good, not for you, that broccoli is tasty. Or it's just an expression of yay for broccoli. It's an expression of emotion that's not true or false. Here's a trickier one that philosophers discuss a lot. Murder is wrong. True or false? Here philosophers are more divided. I don't know, 50-50, maybe that's not a fair estimate. A lot of philosophers think that it's just like the broccoli. Boo for murder, or something relativistic. But a lot of philosophers think it's just like a factual statement. That is true or false. Murder is wrong. There is a fact of the matter here. Now, I don't think when we think about knowledge in ordinary life, we don't have to decide these issues. What we have to do is be very clear that, okay, there are these cases, like broccoli is tasty, and perhaps moral claims, like murder is wrong, that it's not clear that there is a truth of the matter there. But most cases are not like that. Global warming is caused by carbon dioxide. It's not like that, right? 3 million immigrants voted illegally in the American election. It's not like that. It's true or false, as it happens. False. All right, so now we have that. Now we can get to the psychology, the psychological obstacles of knowledge. Why is it that in certain situations we don't take in knowledge? Well, psychologists talk about something they call cognitive biases. And these are mechanisms that make us not think and act in perfectly rational ways. And in the case of knowledge resistance, there are a couple of these cognitive mechanisms that play a very important role. One is confirmation bias. Now this psychology, you never know when you talk about psychological experiments, how reliable things are, but we do know that people have confirmation bias because it's been tested over and over again since the 1960s. And confirmation bias is just this. It's a tendency to want to confirm what one already believes. Right. So if you believe that all swans are white, Well, what do? First of all, you run around looking at lots of more white birds and finding all the lots of swans there. It's great. You completely forget to look among the blackbirds, which you should be doing if you want to test the theory that all swans are white, because you should check to make sure there isn't a swan among the blackbirds. And this is something we can do quite active, but it can also be more passive. It can be that you have some black swans in your garden and you won't even see them because you're so convinced that all swans are white. Now, it can also involve, of course, how you relate to sources. Confirmation bias make you inclined to look for sources that confirm what you already believe. Now, this we've always done, but it's never been easier than today, right? You don't even have to work at it because all you have to do is stay with your Facebook flow. If you get all your news from Facebook, which now about 40% of Americans do, especially young people, if you get all your news from Facebook, you will tend to get news that confirm what you already believe. So here you have an interaction with the very fractured media situation that we have today and our ancient cognitive biases that's always been with us. So why is that? Well, because first of all, your friends function as a filter. Your friends tend to believe what you believe, so they will share things that you like. And then, of course, there are the algorithms that make it the case that whenever you like something or share something or comment on something, you will get more of the same kind. Right? And this interacts with confirmation bias in a very, very problematic way. It can also be less conscious, of course. It can be a matter of how we weigh evidence and how we take in evidence. We won't even see the black swans because we want to confirm our belief that all swans are white. What's interesting about confirmation bias is that intelligence is not a protection. The smartest students, when you make experiments on them, the smartest Harvard graduate students, they will go up, maybe 20% of them will pass a test. But most people will just fail the confirmation bias tests that experimental psychology have designed. Education is not a protection. In fact, when it comes to politics, people who know more about politics display more confirmation bias because they're very, very skilled at finding lots of arguments for their position. What is the protection, which is interesting, is that when we interact with other people, so the smartest students won't be able to figure out, get past this test for confirmation bias. But if you put 3 or 4 ordinary people together and let them talk in a dialogue, they will be able to solve the problem that's required. They will be able to overcome the confirmation bias that's required to solve the problem that they've been given. And this is super interesting, right? Because, of course, the point is, it's not like we have a general tendency to confirm beliefs. We just have the tendency to confirm our own beliefs. So if you put a few of us together in a room, we will ask each other, we will question each other's beliefs, we will discuss, and we will quickly be able to get past the problem. Which, of course, means that it's really important that we don't all have the same belief when we enter the room, because if we do, it's well known that people who walk into a room believing the same thing, they will walk out of that room having more extreme convictions about this topic. And there again, we have a problem with this current media situation, because of course, if you only talk to people who believe what you believe, you're going to push each other towards the extreme. If you have a Facebook group where you all have one thing that you're pushing and no one from outside will push against it, you're all going to move more towards the extreme. This is also a very big problem. Here's something else that American researchers have looked at for a while. Well, researchers all over, but there's one team, Dan Kahan and his team at Yale, who've done lots of cool experiments recently on this stuff. It's been noted for a while that we want to confirm the beliefs that belong with our political, ideological, cultural group. So if to my group, let's say I create this group, and our big belief is that milk is healthy. That's our belief. And we're pushing for, tax subsidies for this, for milk, because we think milk is healthy. And it's all going great because researchers say, indeed, milk is healthy. Then what happens? Well, suddenly they say it's not healthy anymore. What's going to happen then? Well, my group, we're going to feel quite threatened by this. And we will then judge, not that, oh, okay, milk is not healthy, let's change our belief. What we will do is try to dismiss this expert and say, look, that expert is not really very reliable, and he's from a bad university, or what it might be. Now, they've done concrete experiments on this precise phenomenon. For example, they have people read diagrams. So first people identify either as liberals or as conservatives. And then they read these diagrams. And the some people are very good at reading diagrams, some people are pretty good, and they kind of measure their capacity to read these diagrams beforehand. And they give them a diagram over how good a certain skin cream is to cure eczema. So everybody gets to read their diagrams, and some do really well, and some do fairly well, and just as to be expected, in line with their mathematical experience or abilities. Then you switch the topic. It's no longer skin cream cures eczema. It's things that are politically contentious, like whether gun control reduces lethal violence, or things that have to do with climate change, or with immigration. Factual claims, right? You let people read the same type of diagrams, no difference. What happens? Suddenly no one can read the diagrams. And the people who are the best at reading the diagrams are making the most mistakes. That is, the people who are most skilled in reading these things make the most mistakes, when the diagrams don't support the belief that they have. This, of course, is quite unconscious, but it is a way, like we said before, of resisting evidence to protect your belief. The researchers call it the identity protective reasoning, because the belief is central to your sense of who you are, your sense of identity. You will resist it unconsciously, do what you can to throw away evidence or not take in evidence. It influences perception too. So they did this experiment where they had people watch a video of demonstrations outside a building. And when they tell the liberals that the building is an abortion clinic, the liberals will describe the demonstration as violent and unpleasant, and people are blocking doors and so on. When you tell the liberals, other group of liberals, that it's not an abortion clinic, it's actually a building, it's not, this picture is not related to that experiment, I just took this from that. When you tell them that the building is a military building where they don't allow homosexuals to sign up for military service, then the liberals will see the demonstration as peaceful and pleasant. Very same pictures. And vice versa for conservatives, right? So both sides have this effect. Here, I don't know if you saw this one, it came up in Sweden this summer. A Swedish journalist put it on a Norwegian right-wing extremist site, and only seconds after it was up, comments came in. Oppression of women, it says here. It says it's scary. You can't tell whether they have guns under their, shawls and stuff. Now, if any one of you have been to Sweden, maybe on this size you can see it too. These are empty bus seats. And it only took minutes before these comments were going. Okay, so people talk, so they say this sort of politically motivated thinking has led to this phenomenon which people are calling fact polarization. Fact polarization is a weird thing. Is this? It's, okay, so we are polarized. We have different ideologies, different political values. That we always did. Some people value equality more, some people value freedom more, and so on. These are differences in values. But now what's happening is that political ideology, cultural belonging, gets connected with a set of factual beliefs. A cluster of factual beliefs that have no internal relation among one another, so beliefs about vaccines, whether they work against a certain kind of cancer, beliefs about global warming, beliefs about gun control, beliefs about crime and immigration, factual beliefs. Unrelated factual beliefs hang together in little clusters, go with this group, and then this group over here has a different set of cluster of factual beliefs. That is really crazy, because what political ideology you have has nothing to do with whether or not gun control reduces lethal violence. That's just a fact. And fact polarization, of course, constitutes a very, very big threat to democracy because, of course, if we can't even agree on how the facts are, how are we going to talk about policy issues, how to make society better? So there are two more cognitive sort of mechanisms or phenomena that I want to mention that play a role when it comes to knowledge resistance. One is belief perseverance, which is just this. So you decide you're going to fool me. You tell me I'm really good at something, and you kind of produce all sorts of evidence to make me think that I'm really good at this. And I still think, yeah, great, I'm really good at this. And then you come and tell me, no, sorry, we just made up the evidence. There's absolutely no reason to think you're good at that. Experiments show that in this situation, people will keep believing that they're good at this thing, despite the fact that all the evidence they had for this belief is now gone. The belief perseveres. Then there is another slightly more debated issue that's going on now, which is called backfire effects or disconfirmation bias, which is this idea, which is even crazier. So I believe something, which is false, and you come to me and you say, oh, okay, here's the reason this is false, and you really just show this is false. What happens? Well, if I am rational, of course I should change my mind. I should say, oh, okay, so I don't believe that. But in some cases, when the belief is central to a person's sense of identity and belonging and who they are, people will react by not only by not revising their belief, but by continue to believe the false thing even more strongly. And this is the backfire effect. There have been experiments showing that this happens with people vaccine, in the question of vaccines, whether measles vaccines cause autism, in climate questions. But some experiments show that people can change. What's interesting in the vaccine case is that even when people change their factual belief, they don't change their intention. They still don't intend to go and take the vaccine. So that's a further problem. Backfire effect. So we have these weird things, perseverance and backfire effect, which means this, right? Disinformation sticks. Once it's out there, once someone has taken it in and holds it to be true, it tends to stick. Which is why this is so very, very scary, right? Because you know what this number is, I guess. I just checked the latest number today, but it's a number of false or misleading statements since the inauguration. Now, not lies. We can't determine whether it's a lie because it depends on what he believes and intends, but we know it's false or misleading. Washington Post is counting this. All right. So when you might think it doesn't matter, politicians always lie, and Hillary Clinton too had about 30% false statements during the presidential campaign. Trump was about 75% during the campaign. Politicians lie. We can correct it. It's okay. But precisely because this information sticks, it's not okay. Once it's up there, people will take it in, and then it's too late. So let me say a few words about disinformation. Well, we have all sorts of disinformation. We have the fake news that we've heard so much about. We have lies, and we have propaganda. Here is a graph that you may have seen, which shows the engagement with top 20 election stories in the US. In February, April, you can see 12 million engagement. People were engaged with the mainstream news. Fake news, mainstream news here meaning true news. Fake news was down around 3 million. As we get closer to the election, fake news increase and pass real news by election day. Right. And this, of course, interacts with our emotions, right? Because when we get some news about, say, Trump, we don't like him, we feel happy about the news that come in and say he's done something horrible, so we spread it. Vice versa, something horrible comes in about Hillary Clinton, we spread it because it interacts with our emotions. it also connects with a strategy of doubt that goes back. This is a different kind of disinformation. It goes back to the 1960s and the tobacco companies. When it became clear that maybe smoking is not so healthy, they started worrying a bit, right? What were they going to do? One idea, of course, would be go out and argue, well, it really is quite healthy to smoke. One could try that. But it wasn't looking so plausible. But then someone had the brilliant idea that you don't actually have to do that. All you have to do to make people keep smoking is sow some doubt on the data or the research that's coming in. Sow some doubt on the claim that research shows that cigarette smoking is unhealthy. And what do you have to do that? Well, you just have to say, well, the data are hard to interpret, and researchers disagree, and scientists, one day they say one thing, and next day they say something else. You sow doubt about the whole thing, then you don't have to convince people that it's healthy to smoke. You just make people doubt it. That's sufficient for someone who wants to smoke to keep smoking. There was a book made from this, about this, and a movie called Merchants of Doubt. And here is a famous statement from a memo that was leaked in the 1970s, which I think is quite relevant to what's going on today. Doubt is our product since it's the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the mind of the general public. It's also the means of establishing controversy. Here is another way of sowing doubt, in this case, about sources. This is Rush Limbaugh, who talks about the four corners of deceit. Now it's a circle, but still. So the four corners is academia, media, science, government. This is a way of sowing doubt about the most important sources of knowledge in our human society. And it's very, very dangerous because, of course, if we, like I said before, human knowledge is essentially social. And it means we get our knowledge from other people, from these knowledge institutions. And if people start sowing doubt on knowledge institutions, then human knowledge is in trouble. Now, this connects to something else that's been talked about quite a bit this year, namely authoritarian propaganda and what's distinctive of that. And Hannah Arendt, another philosopher who studied the authoritarian state and authoritarian propaganda quite a bit, she said that the most important thing about authoritarian propaganda is not spreading a lot of false claims. It is rather spreading a lot of completely inconsistent and bewildering claims, so that people, in the end, will just give up the idea that there is such a thing as truth, that you can reach truth, that you can reason your way towards how things are. And this is related to the phenomenon of gaslighting that's been talked about quite a bit this year. It's a movie from the 1940s called Gaslight, where the husband is trying to drive his wife insane. And the way he does this is very clever. He tries to make her doubt her own rationality, her own capacity to reason. And he does it by, for example, moving objects around in the apartment, taking them away. And she says, well, where is the blue glass we always had here? And he'll say, but honey, we never had a blue glass. Things like that, step by step. And the moment she loses her mind is when she says something about the gaslight. It suddenly gets darker. She says, honey, why is it getting darker? And he says, it's not getting darker. And then she loses her mind. And the idea behind gaslighting and authoritarian propaganda is precisely that the goal of the authoritarian propaganda is to gaslight us, so we give up our sense of reason and rationality and capacity to determine what's true or not. This is a little book I'm sure you've seen here too, which is, I think, quite wonderful, by Timothy Snyder, the historian, on tyranny, 20 lessons from the 20th century, where he goes through how a democracy falls apart from inside. And he gives 20 lessons for how one should resist this. Lesson number 10 is believe in truth. And I think it's very beautifully put, so I just quote him here. To abandon facts is to abandon freedom. If nothing is true, then no one can criticize power because there is no basis upon which to do so. If nothing is true, then all is spectacle. The biggest wallet pays for the most blinding lights. Okay. Finally, what can be done? Now we're going to cure this in 5 minutes. No, but there's a lot of research on what to do to counteract these psychological mechanisms. Like I said, we have these inner enemies, these psychological obstacles that make us resist evidence, and we have the outer enemies, this disinformation issue. And to deal with this, of course, we need both sense and sensibility. So let me say a couple of words about sense first, critical thinking. So disinformation, it's very important to remember that the kind of onslaught of disinformation that we're facing today is our own fault to an extent, right? It's not spread by itself. We spread it. So it turns out that 6 of 10 links are shared without people even clicking on the link. I mean, never mind reading the text before you share it. You don't even click. How then are you going to know that this is at all something to be trusted? So we all have to be very, very, very careful with what we share. We have to take responsibility for this. I was recently at some panel with some media researcher, and they asked him, what is the best thing to do? He said, never ever share anything. Now that might, of course, be a solution. I don't think it's going to happen, but at least read the text. Check the sources. Because that, of course, is an indirect way of evaluating a statement. Does it come from a reliable source or not? If not, then perhaps I should stop and think. But then there is, of course, a more direct way of evaluating content, too. Evaluating a statement. Looking at the content, looking at the arguments, looking at the evidence provided. And there's one thing to remember here. In the schools these days, people talk a lot about critical thinking. And everybody should be critically thinkers, and that's what we should train the kids in school. That's the important thing. It's important then to remember that critical thinking is not some generic skill that you can carry on from one area to another. Critical thinking requires knowledge. To evaluate an argument, to evaluate evidence, you need knowledge in the area. Researchers say critical thinking is domain specific. So we should not forget that critical thinking, it's a good thing to know a bit of logic and all that, the philosophers talk about, but you also need knowledge for most part in order to do critical thinking well. Okay, so self-knowledge. It's not so bad to have a bit of knowledge about these cognitive mechanisms. That we all have a tendency, for example, towards confirmation bias. As researchers, as academics, no matter our education or our intelligence, this will happen to us. It's a good thing to be aware of. And of course, what we always should do, especially when it's a belief that we really care about, that's really central to our sense of who we are, is to try to consider the best objections to it, right? Now, once I was on the radio and they had people call in asking for advice. So someone called in and said, how do I know if I'm fact resistant? Well, I said, look, think about this. What would change your mind? What would it take to change your mind? Think of something that would make you change your mind on this issue. If the answer is nothing, then you probably have a problem. Then you are fact resistant. Because there should be something that would change your mind. It's worth thinking about. Now, of course, changing a mind, and especially something to think about when one talks to other people, is that it's not an easy thing to do. The thing about beliefs is that they tend to come not one on one, they come in clusters. So if you change one belief, you have to change lots of other beliefs. Say that you believe that global warming is not caused by human activities. It's a very central belief to you. Then you will have all sorts of other beliefs around. That it's fine to drive your car, it's not going to make a difference. The number of beliefs you will have to change that one belief will be lots and lots. Suddenly you may have to believe that Uncle Bob is not reliable. That's a very scary thing to change your belief about. So one has to be aware that changing a belief requires changing lots of belief, which means that there is this threat posed. And because there is this threat, we need to remember that it's also a question of sensibility. How do we reach through? How do we get through to the other person when the belief is very central to them and when they're very emotionally invested? How do we get behind the shield? That is the challenge. And there's lots of research showing that absolutely central to do that is to try to create a situation where there's trust and respect. Going out and hitting people on their heads with how things are is not going to work ever. And there's some concrete advice you can do. Make people talk about things that they feel proud about, feel that it's good about themselves. Then people are more willing to take in evidence. Also, there's always the possibility, no matter how much you disagree, there will always be something you agree on. Try to start from there. Try to figure out what you both agree on, and then work it out from there. And there's research showing that this is also something that works. Thank you. I'm going to end with this quote from an American journalist, Abe Stripp. Nobody's ever been convinced by being made to feel stupid. Thank you.
Thanks, very much. So we have time for a few questions? Or is it best?
Yeah, there is a drink reception
Oh, right.
first, and then we'll resume for the Q&A.